have we got any ground rules with regard to swearing, being abusive to the opposition, and other such things?
Yes, it's highly encouraged.
and making hopefully funny points.
Fuck yes.
Yes, it's
Well, I'm gonna be very lenient on that sort of thing. So if it seems in keeping with what you're saying, then yes, you can do that. Can everyone see the clock? Has everyone got a view of that?
I can see it. It's glorious. Yep. Let's do it.
Sure.
I'm the only one I can see. Can everyone else see everyone else?
No, it's just you on cam.
Yeah.
Are we not doing cameras then? You're fighting a losing battle when they see my beautiful face.
The beard is what does it.
The beard is awesome, man.
It is truly glorious.
So this is us going live. So welcome everyone to the Liberalists Debates. The statement tonight is that the House believes that the state has no right to limit gun ownership. We will have Frank and Tim arguing for the statement, and arguing against the statement we have Cameron and Richard. I'll let you guys just say a quick hello. So
all right, I'm Frank for the motion. How's it going, guys?
Hello, Frank.
Hi, I'm Tim. I am for the motion, and I do have a gun addiction.
Hi, Tim.
Thank you. Someone got the joke.
I am Cameron. I am against the motion, and I am a raging communist.
Oh, blimey. I'm Richard. I'm also against the motion. I'm most certainly not a raging communist, and I actually own a gun, which is a glue gun.
Hate you so much.
At least you can glue the doors shut in case something awful happens.
Exactly.
Excellent. Welcome, guys, and thanks for coming for this debate. Just for the audience's information, we're going to be running a variation of the parliamentary system, for and against. So we have two teams of two. We will have 10 minutes for each statement. The fours will begin, and I think Frank will be outlining his argument for. Then we'll have 10 minutes against, and then another 10 minutes for, and then another 10 minutes against. And anyone can raise a point of information. There's a maximum of 4 per statement. We're going to try and keep them fairly snappy, just a question or an actual piece of information or a slight interjection. But yeah, hopefully by the end of that, we will have some idea of who's ahead, but the final decision will be in the audience's hands. So good luck, everyone, and if everyone's ready, I will hand over the floor to Frank.
All right, and as soon as the clock starts, we will begin. And there it goes. Okay, the motion put in front of us is the state has no right to. If you could just repeat the statement one more time.
Certainly. The state has no right to limit gun ownership.
Yes, the state has no right to limit gun ownership. And that ultimately drills us down to what is the nature of rights in general. And which brings us to the question of what is a right. Rights, as a matter of fact, are rather modern, they're rather new. And they're a unique feature of liberal governments. And their feature is that rights limit what this, and they explicitly say what the state is excluded from prohibiting in practice. So anything that a right is anything that the government, not that the government says. It's a feature within liberal governments where the state is explicitly excluded from prohibiting a practice. And the reasons why liberal states in the most modern era practice the use of rights and guarantee them is to incentivize productivity and investment from individuals in those governments and in those societies. And it works. Governments where rights are honored and exalted produce vibrant economies and high-producing and faithfully invested individuals. It must be clear, however, that a right is not a part of an ambiguous social contract. They are rather legitimate, clear, and a defined part of a legal contract, usually found in the form of a constitution or other legal framework authenticated by the governed. Not the government, the governed. With this in mind, the next question is, should governments have any inherent right to purview limiting any right? By definition, no. Any government that curtails or makes exceptions to a declared right is in fact in breach of a legal framework. It is a violation of a legal contract. This is a stark contrast to things that we assume are under the social contract, things like privileges granted by the state, things like driving licenses, marriage licenses. These are things that are not and have never been rights as enumerated by a governing document. Rights are only rights when they are legally defined and explicitly stated as such. Which brings us to directly address the question of whether or not the state should limit an individual's right to gun ownership. The first question we have to ask is, was it a right explicitly stated in the laws of their nation? If not, then no, they do not possess that right, and the discussion or equivalence to a people and their state of affairs regarding that alleged right is moot. It doesn't exist. It's not relevant. But if the governed do have a right, a declared legal right to it, then yes, the government is of course completely restricted by a legal contract to prohibit or deny that right to any individual. And that's where we get to the situation as to whether or not the state has a right to limit gun ownership. It depends on their state. It depends on whether or not they have that legal contract. Now, I'm also going to segue into reality at large. And in reality, we do live in what I call a mad world. We live in a world where anyone around you at any time can do something horrible and awful to you. There's always a bigger fish. There's always a stronger man, and it makes sense why in liberal societies, why in liberal nations, why we would have a provision, a right to self-defense. Because it ensures the reality of MAD. Now, when I say MAD, I'm using it's an acronym for mutually assured destruction. This is when two parties realize that if one were to attack the other, it's a lose-lose scenario. Both sides ultimately lose. Take note that in virtually every case of a mass shooting and death, the culprit usually dies. In rare instances where they are not, they are then tried, convicted, and then probably put to death by the state. And it's not a question of worrying about whether or not we live in a mad world. The fact is we do. And the chances that we'll survive it is fairly high. And if it was that horrible of an idea, the Cold War would have been far bloodier, and mass murders would not even stand trial after committing atrocities.
Point of contention. I find it fascinating you're saying we live in a mad world when, in fact, crime, with the exception of internet-based crimes like hacking, has been going down rather than up. And things have been more safe now than in almost any other time in history.
And yet, just yesterday, we had mass riots across the United States. Mass looting, a lot of people on video being killed for defending their own store. We live in a goddamn mad world, whether you want to like it or not. Now, the fact that these things happen and can happen doesn't detract from the fact that it is real. But if we look at other societies where mad is not assured, where that reality is not embraced, where people do not have the opportunity to defend themselves, places like Nazi Germany, places like Cuba, places like the old Soviet Union, they are far bloodier than the West. Now, I'm just going to close. I know I have a few extra minutes, but I don't mind closing early. The right to own guns is therefore necessary to incentivize productivity and investment from individuals with the state that is contractually, legally obliged to maintain that right. Any arguments concocted to justifying the infringement of this right breaks the reality of MAD, and it also breaks the legal contract. And that's where I'll end.
Okay. I would like to start very quickly just to point on those, and then I'll pass it off to my friend. But I just need to make some quick comments. First of all, it's very fascinating the way, the way we're defining rights here is it seems like it has to be legally defined. However, if we're talking legally defined, that must mean that it's going to be legally defined by some kind of government. And I don't necessarily think it's reasonable to say that the government should both define what the right should be under legality, but then have no choice to the right.
Well, point of information. I didn't say that it was defined by the government. I said it was defined by the governed, but you may continue.
Okay. It's okay. Then I guess it would have to be legally defined by the governed, which then everyone can have a different definition. The other interesting point of contention, other thing, you say that there should be no curtailing of rights at all. Does this mean we should not curtail the right to the freedom of movement a person has in, say, a prison? And if the answer is no, we should not, then can you see how that might be a problem, not limiting the movement of a criminal? If your answer is yes, we should, then either freedom of movement is not a right, and it would not be an attack on your rights for me to, say, imprison you in your home for the rest of your life, or, so, no, that's actually it. Okay. And I'll pass it off now to my friend.
All right. Thanks, Frank, for that. Is the timer going to start? Oh, yes. So, yeah, thanks very much for that, Frank. Firstly, I would like to totally acknowledge that some people need to have guns. Farmers need to have guns for pest control. Hunters need guns to kill game at a distance if they're no good at using a bow and arrow. Sports people need guns to do clay pigeon shooting, target shooting, all of those kind of things. Armed robbers need guns to do their profession too. And with the possible exception of the latter, I'm totally in support of these people being vetted and having the right to have guns, so long as they keep them securely and don't kill anyone with them. Now, I'm surprised that so far the argument that guns don't kill people, people kill people hasn't come up yet. And the argument that because bad people already have guns, then the government really shouldn't restrict the rest of it, put the rest of us in danger by preventing us to have guns too. And the theory, which I think was alluded to, is that of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, that no one would be mad enough to start a nuclear war, no one would be mad enough to start a shootout. But I would say that the reality on the street, I think we've got pretty pretty lucky with the Cold War. And the reality on the street is that any minor disagreement, some road rage or anything like that, has the potential to escalate in a shootout really easily. And it's not a matter of good or bad, because each of us has good and bad in us. And just because we might believe in the moment that we're on the right side of a conflict doesn't mean that we don't have our blind spots. For example, if you see someone mugging someone, do you shoot them? What if they're running away after mugging someone? What if they are out running and someone tells you they've just mugged someone? We get into some really grey areas there. And if there is a shootout and then the police turn up to an incident and then everyone's shooting guns at everyone else, it makes it really difficult to know, again, who the goodies and the baddies are. Whereas, if guns were really controlled to the point where they were totally the exception rather than rule, as they are in the UK, then things become much clearer. Basically, if you're not part of the government gang in blue, the boys in blue, and if you have a gun and they tell you to put it down and you don't put it down pretty damn quick, then it's pretty clear who the police are going to have to shoot. Having guns as the exception rather than the rule makes it so much easier to police. Yeah, of course, in the US Constitution, you don't have the same trust in the government that us Brits do. Understandable. Second Amendment is explicit. You have the right to keep and bear arms, and that shall not be infringed. But we have to ask, what arms? Now, I don't know if you're Elon Musk fans, seems like a pretty good bloke to me. Did you know that he started a company called the Boring Company, and they made and sold 20,000 flamethrowers at $500 each, and they sold out.
God bless.
God bless
My
that.
question is, what if he made personal protection hand grenades, weaponized drones? What if he used his vast wealth to make himself some nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons? Not to use just for his own protection. But then, what if he takes too much acid, becomes paranoid, and gets the idea that people are destroying the planet, and there's only one way to save the planet, and that is that for there to be significantly fewer people, and to blow them up with his nuclear weapon. He's compelled to do it. Should the state have the right to limit his ability to own a nuclear weapon? I would argue absolutely yes, because it's the role of the state to look after the life, liberty, and happiness of people, and people can't be very alive, nor liberty, nor happy if they're nuclear bombed.
Well, I have a point of information on that. The reason why Elon Musk would not be, well, to be real, the reason why Elon Musk would even be able to have his nuke apprehended is because the government themselves have nukes, correct?
Yes.
Well, so that's mad.
Well, I don't know. What do you mean? The reason that he could have them apprehended is because of the government? I'm not thinking that a really good way of stopping Elon Musk developing his nuclear weapon is to nuke him. Now, that sounds like a terrible idea.
Well, no, but it's the Cold War phenomenon. You know, the ultimate threat of mad is what keeps people happy and sane.
I would say let's stop Elon Musk making his own nuclear weapon before he actually gets there, rather than after.
It's very, like, if we're talking about the Cold War is lucky. Like, there's been uncovered multiple situations in which both people were ready to fire or about to fire or even planning on firing, but did not fire off of pure luck or some kind of happenstance. There were situations in which there were false alarmed red flags in which they were going to launch a nuclear bomb because they thought Russia had already launched it when they did not. The idea that we can have nuclear arms and not have a situation like this happen at some point is a little bit insane. And even if we can accrue countermeasures, it only takes a few nuclear arms in order to block out the sun, regardless of if it hits anyone, and cause a nuclear winter, which could kill untold numbers of people.
Well, thank God we're talking about guns and not nukes.
Another point of order, hand grenades are actually legal to own in the United States with certain licenses.
Bloody hell. Oh my goodness.
God bless the USA.
That with that said, they're kept real careful track of by the ATF and are usually held by war museums and whatnot as destructive devices.
So do you agree that there should be that it's okay to have some weapons with regulation then? Because it seems like you're saying the reason these hand grenades aren't an issue in America is because of how highly we regulate them.
Largely because I don't actually agree that there should be regulation, purely because making your own explosive device is not that terribly difficult, vis-a-vis Boston bombing.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea for bombs to be regulated by the government as well. Mm-hmm. So
Richard, I don't want to interrupt too much on your time, but you've got just over 2.5 minutes left of your statement.
It says 5 minutes 27 seconds.
For some reason it froze.
I stopped the clock because of point of information and the reaction time, and I just wanted to continue because he got back the word.
Good. Okay. Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, so are we on 5 minutes 20 seconds, 7 seconds then?
Yeah, there we go.
So we've actually just touched on the next point I was going to make, which is about psychological distance. And this is that, unfortunately, the level of destruction of a weapon seems to be inversely related to how easy it is for the weapon to actually be used. And it's easier to push, or it's relatively easy to push a button when the destruction of millions of people is happening in a different country on the other side of the world where you're never going to see them. Similarly, it's relatively easy to pull a lever which lets loads of bombs drop out of your plane, killing people that you're never going to see thousands of feet below you. Shooting a gun, again, it's a matter of pulling a trigger and seeing a person drop somewhere over there. Now, when we start getting a bit more difficult is then when we get into stabby type weapons. Stabby and cutty weapons, where you actually see the blood, or you feel the effect that you're having on the other person. You see the blood and you see the look in their eyes. And then, of course, perhaps the extreme, if you don't count harsh language, is actually using your hands to throttle the other person, which is a really kind of difficult thing for people to do. People, thankfully, are inhibited from hurting other people. As this chap, SLA Marshall, who's this army officer in World War II, he wrote a book called Men Against Fire. And one of the things they noticed was 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 infantry soldiers were actually firing their weapons in World War II. And he investigated why that was, and he put a number of, it's not so good for winning a firefight, right? And so they changed the training of soldiers to make them more likely to fire their weapons at the enemy. And the way they did that, one of the things was they stopped firing at round targets and they started firing at human-shaped targets. They basically made the training a lot more realistic. Now, this isn't unlike what we have as leisure activities now, laser tag, airsoft, or even Fortnite and games, first-person shooters played on the computer. Basically, violent games and violent films are desensitizing all of us and training us out of our natural inhibitions to hurt other people, but particularly to shoot other people. And I don't advocate for censorship, so what's left? People can only shoot people if they've got access to a gun. And if the government restricts access to the guns, less people, or fewer people, should I say, are going to be shot. But more than that, I think it should be on the government to try to change the inhibitions which have been eroded by the contemporary culture. Now, having a gun kind of makes you look like John Wayne, which is cool. But what if it was possible to make having and using a gun be the action of a coward, not a hero? Now, I think gang members are even going to be able to get behind this. Rather than rapping about bitches, Benzes, 9s and AKs, what if they're rapping about bitches, bicycles, and bloody great big fuck-off swords? That's cool. That's cooler than guns. Rather than I popped a cap on his ass, it's I separated his head from his body.
This is awkward that I have to give a point of information on this one. There was one of the big videos that's going around viral because of the riots is in fact a man wielding a sword defending his shop, and the mob swarmed him and beat him, and he is, like, if you see the photos, his hips dislocated. They were literally stoning him with rocks. So while the sword sounds nice and cool, it does nothing to a mob.
Well, correct.
And the mob was pretty up close and personal.
And I imagine if everyone in the mob had guns, he would have had even less of a chance than he did. So
I would love it if he had a machine gun.
If he had, do you think like a mob of people with guns versus one guy with a machine gun, the single individual person would be likely to win there? What will keep that man in his shop safe is not going to be his gun. It might protect him from an individual robber or something like that, but what's going to protect him from a mob is going to be a stable society.
Which you're not guaranteed.
Yeah, corruption in government does tend to destabilize society.
I'm sorry, it wasn't the government rioting in the street. It wasn't the government raiding his shop.
They're rioting because of government corruption.
What corruption? They charged the officer. What more did they want?
Him to actually be charged with murder.
He was charged with murder.
No, he wasn't. But we can look that up afterwards. We can make a follow-up post. No, he wasn't charged with murder. To my knowledge, he was being charged with, like, let's take a look here. Floyd. Also, most importantly, he wasn't even charged or arrested first. It took the riots to get him arrested. He had to be
no. He was charged before the riots even started.
That one's just not true. He was fired, and then he was arrested after the protests started, and then riots broke out.
Riots broke out after he was charged, correct.
From Peter on to everyone, he was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter.
Thank you.
Okay, that's an ongoing situation, but we won't get too diverted into the riots, although it is an interesting topic. So we have 1.5 minutes left for Richard. Do you have any more points?
Yes, just to kind of bring things to a close there. You know, even though I think swords are pretty bloody cool, even better,
they are.
Take weapons out of the equation completely. Have strict sentence for anyone brandishing or using any kind of weapon. Now, granted, it's not going to take violence out of the system. So I figure we have to direct that violent instinct into something which has the least amount of chance that it's going to get terminal. And I think fist fighting is probably at that level. And we see it with MMA. It's something which is becoming, thankfully, more popular and hopefully a more kind of honorable and less terminal way of settling problems. And bringing it back to guns, I had this teacher, absolutely hard bastard of a Muay Thai teacher, and he would talk about how you beat 3 guys up at once. But he said, as soon as someone gets a gun out, you give them your wallet. And there's it takes the ego out of the thing, because it's the other person that's done the wrong thing in that case. And my final closing remark, again, thinking about fist fighting as the honorable alternative to gunfighting, is that maybe the Second Amendment needs another amendment. So the right to bear arms becomes the right to bear arms, the right to roll one's sleeves up and defend oneself with fists rather than bullets.
Excellent. So next we will have, I believe, is it Tim to be the second for?
Yes, I will take this. Okay, so been taking some notes here on police arriving to a situation between 2 parties engaged in a shootout and not knowing who is the aggressor. It's fairly simple. Police show up, they point guns at everyone, they say, drop your weapons now, put them on the ground. And people who are typically the lawful concealed carrier, if they're in position to do so, are taught in classes across the United States to put the firearm down on the ground, back away from it, hands up, let the police handle the situation from there. As far as what to do when coming across a mugger, it depends on the situation you're in and the context of that situation. If someone is mugging you, and I can speak from personal experience from here, do you shoot them? No, but sometimes drawing the firearm makes them immediately think, oh shit, I want no part of this, and run. As far as, well, someone running away, do you shoot the mugger? That entirely depends on if you know that they are going to go seriously maim, hurt, or kill another person right then and there. That's the legal framework we currently have, and honestly, I do believe that comes from a moral one. And if you know that they are, say, running towards another person, it's like valuables in the air and they have a weapon raised and they're about to hurt someone, then yes, you are perfectly within your moral and legal right to draw your own weapon and defend that person at that time. But if they're just running away and look like they're running away, then you do not have a moral point. Sorry, a
Legal.
legal, yes. Yeah. A legal point to pull your firearm and shoot that person, because no life is in danger. At that point, it is only someone's property, and you can effectively let the police handle it from there. It's like we already touched on hand grenades for personal ownership, so I don't see any need to go further into that. Now let's go into WMDs for personal protection. Oh my God, I really do not like this comparison, because when it comes to self-defense, using anything that could protect, that has a nearly 100% rate of getting you killed is quite simply moronic. No reasonable person would walk around with a backpack or a suitcase nuclear bomb for self-defense.
Point of contention. Oh yeah, go ahead.
There are a hell of a lot of unreasonable people around, or people whose sense of what's reasonable is guided by ideology, which in itself is unreasonable.
Second point of contention, you're assuming that this would be like just a random guy. Do you not think the Walton family can afford a nuclear missile silo and would not be able to get great bargaining power by having a nuclear missile silo? It's not just going to be a guy with a backpack.
Depends if the silo comes with its own ICBM.
It would be presumed that it would be fully operational to having WMD.
Well, personally, I am of the opinion that WMDs should not exist throughout the world. However, as that is clearly not the case, I do not believe that WMDs, either nuclear, biological, chemical, or what's the last one? Let's see here. It's like, but the whole wide variety of WMDs should not be in the hands of your typical private citizen. Only governments, which the private citizens have control over. Okay. As far as video games causing desensitization and violence, that was settled way back in the 90s. If any of you recall Jack Thompson, sadly, I very much do. There has been no study linking video games to violence or any popular media to violence. This has been settled. Please, for the love of God, stop.
Amen.
Based.
It's like, as far as using a gun is the action of a coward, well, you are more than entitled to hold that opinion. I very much disagree, because to me, it's not the tool that matters; it's the action that matters. I think that mugging and robbery is the action of a coward, but if the person being mugged has a firearm, then it does level the playing field quite a bit. if firearms were largely removed from the world, as a great example, it's like you're not going to remove violence. You're just going to make a case of, well, people can use their fists. Well, at that point, might becomes right, and there's no great equalizer for the single mom working 2 jobs just to work through a nasty neighborhood, or the elderly couple that can't afford to move out of the place that they grew up in, and it became a very nasty place. At that point, you're just making it just turns them into the victims of any decently able-bodied person that decides to enact force upon them. Firearms in this instance are the great equalizer. Doesn't matter if you're a 6'5" bodybuilder taking on a 5'4" single mom. She's got a .38 revolver and manages to put shots in him, he's going down. You take the firearm out of that equation, he can beat the shit out of her all he wants, and she can't do much about it. And I yield the remainder of my time.
Sure.
Hey, you've got quite a chunk of time there, so if you wanted to, you could allow Frank to step in if he has any more points to flesh that out.
Absolutely, Frank. You want to hop in on this?
Sure, why not? I may as well. It's fascinating that you've nailed it dead on the nail with the reality that it does make might the distinguishing factor. I mean, arguing for fisticuffs, arguing for a brawl is all well and good, but it takes 2 things out of the equation. The first is numbers, and the first is the fact that fighting, while you can be skilled at it in most scuffles in public, it's mostly a contest of strength. It has nothing to do with your inherent rights as a citizen of a nation, and it certainly does not incentivize you to be a productive and invested individual. This is why the right to arms exists. It's for the governed to be comfortable and not just comfortable, but confident in the investment that they are making into the society in which they live. That's why we have all these. That's why having a gun for the single mom is important when she's potentially might come across someone who is much larger than her. The right to self-defense, the right to gun ownership, is inherently the right to one's own self-determination. That's what is seemingly being taken out of the equation. This right has a purpose and a function to make society confident in its ability to run and in their ability to be self-actualized. No one is afraid of an armed society. If everyone is armed, then everyone tends to be polite.
Point of contention, that is just completely not true. The increase of gun ownership turns situations more deadly more often. It also increases like actual cases of things like domestic violence and things like that. I can actually pull up the information here. Armed society is a deadly society.
Wilson, I find that very, very inconvenient for you, because most of the shootings that take place, most of the mass deaths that take place, they're done in areas where other people are not armed. Gun-free zones, courthouses, and all these other areas. The expectation when people come to bear arms against another person unjustly and outside of the law are done so with they are predatory acts. They are not acts of equal aggression or assertion. If all things are equal in a society and people are expected and capable of being armed, yes, it is a polite society.
Last point of contention, it's not relevant that there are gun-free zones. When the surrounding area are filled with guns, of course it's not going to matter. But if we take a look at a place like Japan that has an extremely low number of guns in the country and things like that, shootings are exceptionally rare and the amount of violence is extremely low by comparison. a gun-free zone, a sign won't fix anything. What's going to fix the amount of violence from there is the reduction of number of guns in your society. That will decrease shootings.
Another point of order on that one, or point of information rather, Japan also has a massively different culture than the United States that emphasizes going along with the flow, do not stick out.
That's being put, like, I don't think you know a lot about Japan, because Japan is going through massive social changes between the new generations that are questioning all the previous social orders of Japan and the old wave that hold to these traditions. Like,
And they make really good swords.
yeah, they do.
Well, yes, they make really
Yeah.
good swords, but that I don't agree. I'm sorry, but when people do these acts, they're not going in acts where, where a gun is likely. It's a predatory act. So the idea that limiting guns is going to lower the activity or the crime is frankly ridiculous. The fact that more people buy guns and therefore gun violence rises is more correlation than causation. You have to admit that. The fact that more people are out of fear buying guns to defend themselves is not an indication of violence. It's an indication of availability, sure, but the fact and reason surrounding why these events take place isn't because guns are more widely available. It's because they are easy targets. That is a fact, and it's because they're in areas, like I've said, where mutually assured destruction is being ignored, where people's right to defend themselves has been inhibited. So the availability is a non sequitur. And honestly, I don't think there really needs to be much more said on that topic.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the availability point again? Hello?
Did you get that, Frank?
Get what? Oh, and
From Cameron.
I was asking you to repeat what you just said about availability.
It's a non sequitur. The availability doesn't reflect the nature of those committing these atrocious acts. It doesn't change the fact that most of these acts are being committed as an act of predation. They are not. People are not committing mass shootings in the town square next to the police station and city hall. They're going to schools. They're going to courthouses. You're equating two things that might correlate, but they're not directly connected. It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think expecting a little old lady who's walking home to be defending herself with her gun makes no sense, because it's going to be the person who's most likely to use that weapon first, who has the most power in the situation. And I can just imagine someone saying, well, you had a gun, why didn't you use it? And that essentially becomes a form of victim blaming that wouldn't be there if the gun wasn't in her possession.
We've kind of already used our 4 contentions. I think we should give Frank our time now, his time now.
Yeah, I think, well, I would say we've probably gone as far as we can with that last bit. So
Right.
I will move on to Cameron to give him his chance at the second against argument. But afterwards, if there are any points that we need to finish off, I'll give a bit of extra time. But I think we should move on now to Cameron, if you would like to make your
Absolutely.
statement.
So I want to first, because normally I would like to debunk what they're going to say, but first I need to make my statement and then debunk it. So America has a 25 times higher murder rate than any other high-income nation. If we take a look at both the East, the West, gun crime is extremely low. All of these countries have different cultures. all of these countries have one thing in common: extremely low amounts of murder rates with guns, and in actual cases of mass stabbings that some people might bring up, the amount of people who die is oftentimes lower on average. The reason for this is not because all of them have a different culture. However, I would agree with you if you said that America's gun culture contributes to our murder rate. The reason for this is simply all of these nations have high regulations on guns, if even legal guns at all. America does not have a problem with guns because of our culture. The reason for our gun problem is simply because we have a very large number of guns here. Now, to debunk what he said, how it's a non sequitur, you simply pointed out a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with availability. You simply said, oh, they'll go into schools. They'll go into like courthouses. None of this is relevant. If that's school or courthouses in America, they are in a country with the largest number of guns on the planet. As far as a gun reducing like dangerous situations or suppression of violence, I agree, and that's great, which is why I support legal ownership of firearms. I am not against the ownership of gun at all, and one of the greatest uses of the guns is to suppress potentially violent situations. As far as self-determination goes, this point simply doesn't follow. At the end of the day, some people shoot better than others. I don't know if for all of you have shot a gun before. I have. I missed every one of my targets. I failed miserably because I do not train with a gun. I have not used a gun much. I have not actually trained properly with one. However, a man who has trained with a gun, a person who does know how to properly use it, will be able to hit me more often. And at the end of the day, bodies matter as well. 10 people with a gun are definitely going to beat one person with a gun, even if that man has a machine gun, because machine guns have a high amount of kick, a high amount of kick and recoil, and requiring a certain amount of strength to do it, so that little old ladies would probably not be able to use it effectively. The reality is that guns, I completely support their legalization because I believe in rights. However, it is a silly statement to say that we can have any number of guns in this country, anyone can have high-powered rifles, and it would not cause any amount of problems. And I would like to say that I can actually link information on how guns increase gun violence, as well as make situations more deadly. I can link that afterwards on the Liberalist page, which I shall do. And I'd like to give time now to Peter, my friend.
Sorry, who did you want to come in there?
Oh, I'm just giving it to the other person on my side.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Oh, me?
Yeah, you mean
other...
Richard.
Oh, sorry, Richard. I'm dumb. Don't mind me. Not Peter. Sorry, Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Wow, have I got anything else to say? So I was saying before that I think it's the point you were making, really, the one about training. Just because someone's a female, I mean, maybe not a pregnant female, perhaps, but the chap I was talking about, who's the hard as nails Muay Thai instructor, who talked about beating 3 people up. He's in his 60s or kind of 60s or something, and he was beating up 3 young East European thugs at a time. But the moment they pull a gun, he'll acquiesce and kind of do what they want. And actually, acquiescing is gonna take a lot of the ego out of it from them as well. And there's no ego problem with that.
Well, I do have a point of information. Isn't it true that despite guns being more available and more crime being committed with those guns, isn't it true that the only areas where those gun violence increase are areas where the populace does not have them widely available in those individual states and cities?
So this is kind of an interesting data point and is debated a lot, because there are areas with a very low number of firearms that still have that have fairly high fairly high amount of firearms. And there are also cities with a very high amount of firearms in the city that have very low firearm deaths, but then there are cities with high amounts of firearms and very high amounts of firearm deaths, and then cities with low amounts of firearms and low amounts of firearm deaths.
Yes, I'm concerned about the laws in those states about gun ownership, not
Well,
the actual how many guns are in the city and how many deaths are resulting from the guns in the city. What are the laws regarding individuals having the right to own those guns, and are those guns where the high deaths, if there are high guns and high deaths, if there is in the law of those particular states low accessibility to those firearms, that's probably why we're having low death. It's low accessibility, correct?
well, we would have to look at an individual state as an example, but that would put a point to me
Chicago.
that
Let's try Chicago.
Well, that would put a point to me, however, that availability affects gun violence positively. But I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not super familiar with Chicago. I have a friend who lives in Chicago who could comment. However, one thing that needs to be considered here as well is things like gang violence as well, increasing violent crime, things like that, or the laws in states next to them. For example, you can have one state that has very strict laws on firearms, but if the state next to it is very laxical on firearms, it allows for a very easy black market. Whereas
Okay,
if
so in conclusion, preventing the access to firearms for criminals is essentially impossible, correct?
no, you would not be able to allow for state by state gun laws and have it be effective. Many countries have very strict gun laws and it works very effectively, but that is because they don't allow for individual cities to make their own gun laws. America does, and it allows for easier black markets because there's very little border protection from state to state, and it's very easy to make guns in one state and drive over to the other. Something you would not be able to do in Japan very easily, being an island, and even something that Europe isn't as easy to do, even though Europe has more of an issue with it than Japan for geographical reasons.
A point in the state of Florida, I believe it was the early 2000s when they became a shall issue concealed carry state. Basically means that it's like, without going too much into it, made concealed carry licenses far easier to get for a law-abiding citizen. With the amount of gun ownership spiked. However, the overall violent crime rate kept dropping at the rate that it previously had been and still continues to do so.
And it's fucking Florida. That's amazing.
I know, right?
Yeah. I actually will not contend because to my knowledge, guns do not actually increase the actual violent crime rate, but it does increase the number of things like gun deaths and make situations more deadly. I mean, we can go through, I've got like a couple of different studies here I'm going to intend on posting that we can go through either afterwards or we can go through on the actual page as a post. But no, I won't contend with you that violent crime will just increase just because you have guns. Just because you have a gun, it doesn't necessarily make you want to do a crime more. How much time do we have left?
It says you have 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. If you don't mind, I would like to make one other point, unless he has, my partner has something to say. There was a situation I would like to point out. I'll try to find it for you guys afterwards. I just don't remember the exact state it was in. But a couple of kids were playing behind two houses, and they were going near the trash of that place. And the neighbors came out with shotguns and pointed them at the children and scared them away. Several minutes later, the parent of those children came by to those neighbors and were extremely angry at them that they would point their guns at children, very obviously. what ended up happening is then a pursuing like 5-10 minutes of the guy yelling at those people. And what ended up happening by the end of it was the neighbors who pointed the guns at children shot and killed the unarmed parents of that child who was not actually threatening that person. That person then died. These are examples of how guns can make situations more deadly. Presume for a moment that that neighbor was deemed unfit to have a gun because he seemed to believe that it's okay to point guns at children, and that's something we regulated for. That man would not die. Now, I'd like to say that that may be anecdotal, but it is a proof of concept that that everybody has a different standard for when they feel they should use their gun, that people will have different beliefs on when they should use their gun, and most importantly, not everyone has the same level of training on their guns.
That's wild that not only does that not cover the right to own a gun in a society where it is in fact legally secured, it also crosses over into what we could interpret as property rights and so on and so forth. Did the gun make it worse in this case? Probably, but that doesn't really address whether or not it was in fact problematic. It was, I'm sorry, that there's too much there. That is the purest anecdotal problematic anti-gun contrivance that I've ever heard. He scared off kids with a gun. The parents came back, and they came back unarmed. They came back onto his property, from what I presume, and things escalated to the point to where he shot them on either on his property or as they were leaving, because there was a heightened argument. Could you pick a more befuddled example?
I'm not attempting to use the anecdote as like a point of this is why we shouldn't have guns. I'm simply using it as an example of how A, there are situations in which guns do simply increase the violence of a situation, and that B, everyone has a different standard for their guns. Like,
so my rights should be restricted because someone else is an idiot.
your right should be restricted because it produces the best of results for society. I'm a utilitarian. I would like to say here, I am not saying you should not be able to own a gun. I support your right to own a gun. In fact, and even though some of my leftist friends will yell at me for this and actually dislike me for this, I do not even want to restrict your access to things like an AR or any semi-automatic rifle. I simply am saying, I am simply defending the obvious fact that places with regulations have better outcomes in shootings and guns in their society than we do. And that is simply because we are a highly unregulated society on our weapons. And for the last 2 minutes, I'd like to point out one thing I slightly touched on, but did not actually manage to get to in full detail, and that is the fact that one of the problems in America with gun ownership is that our belief on what constitutes a gun owner is things like having good trigger discipline, having good, knowing how to aim and fire and things like that. We do not consider or oftentimes talk about when it is okay to use our gun and when it is not. Is it okay for you to use your gun on a man trying to escape from a store who has stolen, like, let's say toys
Hang on. Cameron, do you own a gun?
Me?
Yes, you personally.
No, I do not.
Okay, I live in Texas. The stereotype about Texas is you can walk to a Walmart, approach a vending machine, put in some cash, and out pops a gun. Now,
One day.
One day.
Why are you pulling out a stereotype? I don't believe that stereotype.
I know you don't believe the stereotype, but what I'm trying to say is, even in Texas, to get your license to carry, you have to take a course. You have to be educated on the laws. You have to, not only do you spend time on the range to qualify for that license, but you are sat down and it is explained in no certain details everything that you're talking about.
Is that a good idea then?
Huh?
Is that a good idea then, do you think?
Yeah, well, but he's trying to build a scenario that doesn't exist. The idea that the gun owners of America do not take these things into account. You're describing a meme, not reality.
Do you deny the idea that all people will have like different beliefs on when they should and should not use a gun and different circumstances by which they can? I mean, I'm not going to try and provide anecdotes because it's just not relevant here, but like, do you not think that like a person would use a gun in like over a guy trying to steal something? Do you not think that like there's a problem of inconsistency of standard that would naturally form from a diverse population? Like,
No, because everyone who is licensed to own a gun is informed on those laws, standards, and procedures that are predicated upon its use.
So once again,
Everyone.
you're arguing for licensing of guns.
I think he meant license to carry.
Yeah, the license to carry.
so you then
Is that different from owning a gun, which is the topic of this debate? I mean, I'm fine with people owning guns if they're in a vault and they can't get to them, but what you're talking about is carrying a gun, which seems like if I owned a gun, I'd probably want to carry it.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, it is a license to carry, but the thing is, no, you are right. Buying a gun is different from getting the license to carry.
Frank, the problem I have here is you're trying to argue with me that like it doesn't exist, that we don't have an issue with like when people use their gun. Just in my anecdote, like that person deems it okay to point guns at children, and I would never deem that okay.
It's not reasonable because there's a very famous statistic. You know, the number of mass shooters, or the number of people who have how shall we say, misused a firearm in that manner. None of them have been members of the NRA. There's like the gun culture itself that you're alluding to is relatively safe. As a matter of fact,
I'm not talking about mass shootings.
Well, no, but you are talking about like what I can tangentially presume to be gun culture, correct?
I'm saying that I guess technically, yeah, I would say I'm basically talking about when people view it as acceptable to be using their guns in situations. So yeah, gun culture.
Okay, Tim, inform him on gun culture. You're a bigger nut than I am.
Before we go down that route, we've already had quite a few points, and so I'm gonna give Cameron the chance to say whether he wants Tim to join in or if he wants to have his 2 minutes.
I'll wrap up real quick, and then I'll give the rest of my time unless there's anything more to be said from my partner.
Okay.
So to wrap it up really quickly, before we get into the conversation on gun culture, America has an issue with guns, unquestionably, or rather an issue with shootings, unquestionably, us being 25 times higher. And we have a very different culture on guns, and it can be argued sociologically, however, I don't have data prepared for that it increases it. However, more realistically is the fact that every culture that has low amounts of gun deaths and low amounts of gun violence, 100% of them have pretty high regulations on guns, whereas America does not. We have very few regulations on guns, and we allow all of our states to have its own laws on guns, which allow for the creation of black markets and complicated, unregulatory behavior. And with that, I will give up my time.
You have 1 minute, Richard.
Oh, no, good.
Come in.
If I may inquire, do any of these other nations have a right to gun ownership in their founding documents or in their legal framework?
All of them, some of them have laws for gun ownership. For example, in Canada, you have a right to own guns over a large number of different proceedings on getting licenses for that guns, and then certain types of firearms are banned. For example, you can't have, if I'm correct, in Canada you can't have a pistol or sorry.
So
I'm not.
hang on, is it licensed by the state, or is it a right taken from by the governed?
It's a license. It's a law in the state. Like
Okay.
really, only America has the idea of a written constitution with rights. I think there are some places that have something similar, but I'm not highly educated on that subject.
Okay, that was just my last question.
But yeah, most of these places do have laws in which you are allowed to own firearms. In fact, if you just go online and Google Skulligrim, he's a guy, he's in Canada, he has tons of different guns. You're allowed to, I just know that you're not allowed to own like modern day pistols for the most part, and that you primarily are going to have to either use a rifle or a shotgun. So.
In Britain, we don't even have sports pistols competitors for the Olympics because they're not even allowed to have their sports pistols.
Which makes me sad.
That's sad.
Something I do want to point out. The United States has the highest gun ownership rate per 100 residents in the world. This cannot really be disputed. However, as far as intentional homicide rate, the highest is currently sitting is Honduras at 91.6 per 100,000 residents, followed by El Salvador, Cote d'Ivoire, and Jamaica. It's like at 69.2, 56.9, and 52.2 respectively. United States for intentional homicide rate per 100,000 residents, and this is per the UNODC, is sitting at number 103 at 4.8 per 100,000 residents.
Okay, to clarify, is this a part of our time or yours, real quick?
There was 1 minute left on the clock, which should by rights really go to Richard or yourself, Cameron.
Okay. Okay.
What I was going to do is, if you have a big point to make, then you can.
Oh no, it's not a
make it in
big
1
point.
minute.
It's not a big point. It's just quickly that like criminality and things like that in all of these places you make tend to have more to do with like socioeconomic reasons rather than like gun ownership. I am not going to say that gun ownership increases crime because it just doesn't.
Okay. If that's all the points, what I was going to do is, I know that you may still have a few talking points left, so.
Oh no, you're fine. I would like to concede the rest of my time and just get started on the opposition's 10 minutes.
No, we're done.
We're done.
Okay.
Yeah. Everyone's made a statement, but I will, if anyone wants to on the for or against side, I'll allow an extra couple of minutes. If there's any points that you haven't already brought up or you want to summarize your case, just to remind everyone, the original question, the state has no right to limit gun ownership. If anyone fancies some sort of summarizing their arguments for that statement, we'll start with the fours. So Frank or Tim, if you have any further points to make.
Well,
we've only got about a minute for each, or 2 minutes possibly.
Okay,
Frank, you take it.
All right, I'll just go ahead and state that it seems fairly obvious that there's no correlation between gun ownership and the violence and unjust use of those guns, and it also seems fairly obvious that people are incentivized when they have a right to defend themselves to participate in their society, and ultimately that this is really about whether or not you as an individual are invested in the society that you live in, and to what extent you are permitted to do so, or the right to which you have to do so. And it is not lawful for a government where the government has stated that they have a right to self-defense to infringe upon that defense.
Excellent. That was exactly a minute, pretty much. So, Richard and Cameron, I will allow you a minute or two to summarize your case. Who would like to take that?
I would like to, if I can. I'll try to only use 30 seconds for you, man. Okay. In conclusion, very quickly, every single country in the world, well, a large number of our developed nations in the world, all of them have high amounts of regulations on guns, and as a result, positive correlations on gun deaths and things like that, as well as a significantly lower amount of actual rate of crime and things like that. We have every one of these countries have high amounts of regulations. I support gun rights. However, I support regulations on guns because I'm a utilitarian, and it's just shown by every country on the world that regulations on guns create positive correlations towards gun outcomes.
Excellent. Richard, you have approximately 15 seconds if you'd like to.
Yeah, I don't think we can necessarily get rid of violence, but we can get rid of the catastrophic results of that violence. And in London, we're appalled when we hear of someone being knifed, and that's good, I think, because it shows how much more sensitized we are over here. But thinking for a country that does have guns, yeah, I think people carrying swords is going to be overall cooler and safer.
Excellent, excellent. Right. I think that wraps it up pretty much. I'd like to thank everyone for coming along. Just a reminder, the for team was Frank and Tim. The against was Cameron and Richard. And the question that they were trying to answer is the states has no right to limit gun ownership. There will be a poll for users to vote on who they think won the debate.
Well, I'm on the side of it, so it's pretty much automatically going to go to Frank.
And what am I, chopped liver?
Oh, no, it's just people seem to hate me there. I mean...
My shirt there, mate. Don't underestimate the power of my shirt.
That's a fair point. I'd like to thank everyone as well. Wonderful job.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, guys. It was an excellent debate, and thanks to Peter for handling the tech. For the audience,
Love your techie.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to vote if you feel strongly one side or the other. If you are unaware of where to do so, you can go to the Liberalists Facebook page online and check out the thread on there. And we will see you again for another debate very soon. Thanks again. Good night.